Thank you, Nicole. Emma, feel free to start sharing your screen while I do brief introductions. I am honored to moderate this first panel titled Understanding Disparities in Retirement and Disability. The first paper, titled Work and Retirement for Older Black and Hispanic Adults, will be presented by Emma Aguila at University of Southern California. The second paper, titled Structural Barriers to Receipt of Income Support and Health Insurance Among Adults with Disabilities by Race and Ethnicity, will be presented by Meara at Harvard University. The third paper, titled All in the Family, Mothers of Children with Disabilities and Retirement, will be presented by Molly Costanzo at Institute for Research on Poverty and University of Wisconsin-Madison. All right, Emma, take it away, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to present at this meeting. In this study, we examine retirement determinants for non-Hispanic Black and Hispanic older adults. This is a joint paper with Zeewan Lee from the National University of Singapore. Let me see. Okay. So the motivation for this study is that, older Hispanic and non-Hispanic Black will double, the proportion of older adults will double by 2060. So in 2014, Hispanic and non-Hispanic Black represented 17% of the population 65 years old and older, but by 2060, they will represent 40%. So older non-Hispanic Black and Hispanics are one of the fastest growing population groups in the United States. In the figure below, we can observe the poverty rate for older adults 65 years old or older. And we can see the poverty rate for non-Hispanic White, non-Hispanic Black, and Hispanic. You can observe in this figure that the poverty rate is more than double for non-Hispanic Black and Hispanic older adults. So this implies that the increasing proportion of older adults in poverty, will increase in the coming years. And so it's particularly relevant to analyze the determinants of retirement for lower income population. Partly in terms of how do we explain poverty in old age? So partly it's explained by the increasing income inequality since the 1970s that has particularly affected older non-Hispanic Black and Hispanics. There are also large differences by race in terms of the proportion of workers covered by private employer-provided pensions. So you can see that in this bullet point, I have the proportion of workers that has the lowest coverage is Hispanic workers. So 38.4% are covered by private employer-provided pensions, and then there's a higher proportion for non-Hispanic Black and even higher for non-Hispanic White workers. Now it's worth highlighting that Social Security has a very important role because it has a redistributional effect, because Social Security benefits are more equally distributed than pre-retirement income. So we focus in this study, as I mentioned, on analyzing the determinants of retirement for Hispanic and non-Hispanic Black older adults. We use, in terms of data, the Health and Retirement Study from 1992 to 2018. This survey, the HRS, oversampled non-Hispanic Black and Hispanic. We link HRS to Social Security data on lifetime earnings, and we also link the HRS to the Working Trajectories file, so that we can analyze salary gaps and unemployment spells by race. We impute earnings, when we require that we don't have that information in the Social Security data, and we do observe that these respondents are working. We also apply different life expectancies or survival probabilities by race and gender to compute the expected net present value of Social Security benefits. We include in this study respondents 50 to 80 years old. I just would like to show you briefly some of the descriptive statistics of the sample in our study. In the first column, we have non-Hispanic white, in the second column, non-Hispanic black, and in the third column, Hispanic. And we have some of the variables used in the study. You can see that the average years of education is lower for Hispanic than for non-Hispanic black and non-Hispanic white. Real net wealth, you can observe the large differences among the three racial groups. So we see here that real net wealth for non-Hispanic white is 3.5 times higher than for non-Hispanic black and 2.9 times higher than for Hispanics. In terms of contributions to private employer-provided pensions, you can see in this last row highlighted that there is a higher proportion of Hispanics that report not having contributed to private employer pensions, employer-provided pensions. So it's about 50% for Hispanics and about a third for non-Hispanic black and for non-Hispanic white. In terms of the results or like the estimates that we have in our study, in this figure, I'm showing you the earnings for the 50th percentile. So we have US dollars in the vertical axis and in the horizontal axis, the age of respondents. The gray solid line is for non-Hispanic whites. The black dashed line is for non-Hispanic blacks, and the gray dashed line is for Hispanics. So you can observe that between age 60 and 70, for the most part, median earnings are higher for non-Hispanic white. We observe here maybe that they are closer, the median earnings for non-Hispanic black and non-Hispanic white. We have a little bit less precision for ages 60 years old or older for non-Hispanic black and Hispanic because we have a smaller sample size. So this is consistent to what previous studies have found in the literature. In this figure, I show the Social Security wealth that we computed for the 50th percentile, so for the median again. The gray solid line is for non-Hispanic whites, the black dashed line is for non-Hispanic blacks, and the gray dashed line for Hispanics. We have US dollars in the vertical axis, and in the horizontal axis, we have the age of the respondent. So you can see here that Social Security wealth for non-Hispanic whites is higher than for non-Hispanic blacks. We observe that Social Security wealth for Hispanics is, for the most part, higher than for non-Hispanic whites and non-Hispanic blacks. We have a slight overestimation of Social Security wealth for Hispanics that we're now revising. And this is because, well, as we introduce different life expectancies by race and gender, so Hispanics have higher life expectancy. Also, Hispanics are a more heterogeneous group that includes a larger proportion of foreign-born population or immigrants that may have different, so we include all of them together, so they may have different trends in Social Security wealth. We also are pulling in this study, in the results I'm showing so far, we're pulling 26 years of data. So we include different cohorts that have different lifetime earnings. So we're now working on presenting the results for different cohorts. And we're also incorporating new methods on how to project future salary gaps or unemployment spells by race using the working trajectories file. So when we introduce those salary gaps or unemployment spells, we observe a reduction in the gap between the Social Security wealth of Hispanics and non-Hispanic whites, even flipping and obtaining a higher Social Security wealth for non-Hispanic whites than for Hispanics, that it's consistent with previous literature. But the takeaway of this figure is that Social Security wealth is quite similar among the three racial groups, and this can be explained by the redistributive components of the Social Security formula. In this figure, I show the replacement rate for the 50th percentile. So again, we have in the vertical axis, we have the percent, so from 0 to 100%. And in the horizontal axis, the age of the respondent. The gray solid line is for non-Hispanic whites, the black dashed line for non-Hispanic blacks, and the gray dashed line for Hispanics. So you can see that for the most part, the replacement rate is higher for non-Hispanic blacks and Hispanics than for non-Hispanic whites. And this makes sense because they have non-Hispanic black and Hispanic have lower earnings and higher Social Security wealth, therefore their replacement rate is higher. The definition of the replacement rate is the monthly Social Security income divided by the monthly salary income before retirement.
2 minutes, Emma.
Yes. So the finding so far is that median earnings are higher for non-Hispanic white than non-Hispanic black and Hispanic. Social Security wealth is more similarly distributed among the population. Replacement rates are higher for non-Hispanic black and non-Hispanic white. And we have a larger proportion of Hispanics that have not contributed to private employer provided pensions. So, and just briefly to mention, I have 2 slides more. When we run the regression analysis on the determinants of retirement, non-Hispanic black, Hispanic, and non-Hispanic white, they all respond similarly to institutional drivers of retirement, that is to Social Security, private employer provided pensions, and health insurance. However, it's worth noting that in our results, non-Hispanic black and Hispanic are less responsive to some sociodemographic characteristics. So non-Hispanic black to gender, marital status, and number of household residents, and Hispanic are less responsive to gender, education, and marital status than non-Hispanic whites. So just to mention briefly the policy implications of this study so far, are that Social Security benefits have been shown in previous studies. They are a large proportion of the retirement income for non-Hispanic black and Hispanic than for non-Hispanic white. So it's important to highlight that any changes in the U.S. Social Security system will affect the labor force participation, retirement decisions, and overall well-being of non-Hispanic black and Hispanic, and in general, lower income population. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. That was perfect. Next up, we have Ellen Meara.
Okay. So let me stop sharing.
Thank you so much. Can everybody see these well? All right. I just want to thank SSA for funding this. I want to thank folks at NBER for organizing, and my colleagues at Harvard, David Cutler and Meara Gay, who's a terrific PhD student, and also our collaborator from Bowie State, Rand Obeidat, who's also been terrific. So our starting point is something that will be familiar to this group, which is SSDI. So this is looking at determinants of disability. SSDI applications and awards peaked around 2010, and they've been coming down quite a bit since. And in fact, awards are down to levels we haven't seen in 20 years. And we also know that there's a lot of structural things changing in the backgrounds. in different parts that can affect the application process as well as the disability determination process. This wonderful work from Deshpande and Lee looks in a lot of detail at field office closings, which really, there were quite a few of them in this 2010 to 2014 period, as you see on the left. And that work suggests that not only did applications fall in areas affected by those closings, but awards fell by more, suggesting that because of the office closures, maybe the targeting that we hope this program, can achieve was suffering because of those closed offices. And on the right, I have a figure that we created based on favorable determination rates at the initial level. So these are taking place at the disability determination service level. And you see this is also falling over time. So we have these structural changes. I'm going to say more about that in a minute, but we have these structural changes going on related to things like office closures. We have other things going on at the hearing level and above that is also, there's been an effort at policy consistency that has also reduced the allowance rates at the hearing level and above, but we have little data on how these declining award rates may affect different groups. And of course, as you all heard, I was super excited to see the new data. So thank you, Dr. Kijikazi. But as you heard, a lack of race and ethnicity data at SSA sort of hinders our ability to look at some of these things. So this is what's motivating us. And this is really ongoing work. We're actually working to get into some restricted use data sets that, and we're not there yet, but we think we could make a little progress in what we have available at this point. So we're gonna ask two things. How have applications, favorable determination rates, and disability receipt changed over time and across areas? Because we were just wondering, one way to sort of target your efforts to understand equity might be to understand, are there particular places that are experiencing this more than others? And then second, using two publicly available surveys, we're going to ask some questions about how population rates of applying for and receiving federal disability benefits have changed over time by race and ethnicity. And so let me start. This first figure is really going to summarize. This is just based on public data overall, and we're looking at different parts in the disability, the review of disability applications. So when you submit your application, of course, the first thing it goes through is this technical review. And so just to make all of these things, look the same, where higher is you're more likely to be awarded benefits and lower is less likely, we've presented this top line here with the hollow circles. This is the rate of applications meeting technical review. That is what % of applications will go on after the technical review that says, look, are you eligible for the program? Do you have enough quarters? Are your income levels, in the right ranges? And you see a pretty remarkable, first an abrupt, but then a steady decline in the % of applications meeting that technical review. And then we've got sort of the allowance rate. So this is the rate of the applications that proceed to get a medical decision, what % of them will actually receive an allowance. So this is really summarizing a number of processes. And we're also showing here the hearing level and above allowance rate, which we know due to these well-known efforts to increase consistency, really declined quite a bit, and particularly in these years, it looks like starting around 2008 and the next several years. And so when you kind of combine all those things together, the award rate, the % of applications that make it through, looks quite different on the eve of the pandemic than it did around the year 2000. We used to have about half of applications would get through eventually, and we're getting closer to about 30%. So that looks quite different. And so what we wanted to do next was to say a little bit about this cross area differences. And we thought we'd start out with these initial determinations that are happening at the Disability Determination Service. And so this is a combination of initial and reconsiderations that happen at those offices because that's where a lot of the medical decisions occur. And so we looked across states and we just asked, how is that variation changing over time? And what you see is that things are becoming more consistent over time. So there was more variation across states. That's fallen quite a bit from about the standard deviation in these favorable determination rates was as high as 0.08, and it's fallen to about 5% over time. Another way to look at that is to actually compare favorable determination rates in a state in 2010, which I'm showing you on this horizontal axis, to favorable determination rates in 2016, which I'm showing you on the vertical axis. So this red line, this is the 45-degree line. If you're following along this line, you didn't really see much change in your likelihood of getting a favorable determination in that state. And so what you notice, and there's not much happening above the line, there's not many places increasing the favorable determination rates, but you see a number of states, particularly some large states, New York, New Jersey, Texas, and then you have DC and Hawaii as outliers, as seeing a big decline in favorable determination rates over time. And they have moderately high favorable determination rates to begin with. And so in this piece of it, we see the share of decisions with favorable determinations falling. The state variation is falling quite a bit by about a third. And we know that other administrative changes have lowered rates of favorable decisions at other levels. So the rest of the talk is just showing a few things that we can learn from publicly available surveys where we can look at respondents' identified race and ethnicity and link that. And so the first figure I want to show you, this is available from the Public Use Medicare Current Beneficiary Survey. So these folks, and it's limiting to people under the age of 65. And so by definition, everyone responding to this survey is in the Medicare program. And in that under age 65, virtually all those folks are on it due to SSDI receipt. And so it's a great source of trying to learn about this because that program is really a universe of SSDI recipients. Now, here is the survey. We don't have everyone. And what we did here is we said, let's take the weighted estimates of who's in the MCBS each year according to their self-identified race and ethnicity, and let's divide that by the adult population, 18 to 64 in each year. And this gives us a population sort of rate estimate of what's happening by these different groups. And two things really struck us right away in this figure. While you see that, white non-Hispanic rates are kind of steady around 4-ish% of that working age population, you see a decline among Black non-Hispanic adults, and you see an even more marked decline among folks reporting Hispanic ethnicity. So that was quite striking. And in the public use, you don't have a lot of details. So we wanted to go to a survey that gave more detail to understand what some of the factors going into it. So we went to the National Health Interview Survey, and just so you can kind of, have the context in mind, what do they ask? They ask folks, do you have a work limitation, whether it's physical, mental, or emotional problem? So do you have it right now, and does it limit your ability to work? They ask if you've ever applied for SSI or SSDI. So that's helpful, but it's ever, so we don't really know when. And then they ask if you're receiving income from Social Security, and is that for disability? If you say yes, they ask if it's for disability, but we're going to limit to everyone under the age of 65. So if they're getting it for
2 minutes, Ellen.
Disability. So what do we find when we do that? And what I'm going to show you the pictures in the interest of time. When we do that, we find that reported work limitations are actually quite steady over this period. We show these, and these are adjusting for age and sex. So we have taken out 5-year age groups separate, and we have those separately by sex. So you see work limitations are pretty steady until late in the period, and they're kind of going up for everyone, non-Hispanic Blacks in particular, non-Hispanic Asians, non-Hispanic whites. So the reports of work limitations are not changing too much until the end of the period, but applications are rising quite a bit relative to 1999. And particularly for non-Hispanic Black and non-Hispanic White individuals, they're up by about 5%. And then how does that translate into SSDI receipt per capita? We see that receipt is up by about 1.5% to 2% for non-Hispanic Black and non-Hispanic White folks who are, again, reporting higher rates of application, although not necessarily higher rates of limitations relative to other groups. And then the final thing we did, this is a bit messy, but the answer, the takeaway I would get is it's relatively steady over time. The percent of people who told us they applied who then got SSDI later is actually fairly steady across the groups. And so, where do we end up with all of those figures? Well, we know that SSDI allowance rates are falling over time. It all, basically at every level, it's harder for your application to get through. A smaller percent are getting through. And some of the administrative changes have brought more uniform determination rates across states, but we know less about how that's playing out for workers. And I guess we're really struck by, despite steady reported work limitations, the actual receipt of SSDI by Hispanic workers, judging from the MCBS, seems to be falling over time. But when we try to connect that back to, if you submit an application, are there differences across groups? That doesn't seem to be going on. So it may have more to do with who's applying and how it links back to their particular circumstances. So we think all of these are really rich areas for future work to try and understand how to better target the program and help folks get the help they need.
Thank you, Ellen. So next up, we have Molly Costanzo.
Thanks so much. I am excited to be here today among so many old and new friends. And I want to acknowledge my co-authors on this work with Lisa Klein Vogel, a wonderful colleague at the Institute for Research on Poverty, and two great PhD students, Victoria Knoke in social work and Hannah Hahn in the Department of Economics. Thank you so much to Social Security for funding. Also, everything I say here is my view and not that of SSA or the University of Wisconsin. And as you'll hear, we talk to families, so we also want to send a big thanks to families for participating in our study. So in this panel focused on disparities in retirement and disability, we are interested in understanding potential disparities in retirement for one specific population that we don't know much about in terms of the retirement context, and that is mothers of children with disabilities. So we might be concerned about retirement equity for these families because we know that they face greater constraints in work and savings during their prime labor market years, which is going to influence the resources available to them as they enter retirement. And then also into their retirement years, right, they have this unique set of constraints and probably greater financial needs for resources and steeper caregiving responsibilities than we might expect other families to have, right? So there's sort of the sense that these families might have some unique constraints when they're in thinking about retirement. At the same time, there's a variety of Social Security benefits that have the potential to provide economic security for these families. So retirement benefits for mothers, disability benefits for children, SSI payments, and family benefits, such as the disabled adult child benefit. So in this study, we're really interested in understanding what we see. So we're going to look broadly in differences in what I'll think of as objective retirement measures of planning, savings, and timing for mothers of children with disabilities compared to mothers of typically developing children. And then we really want to dig into the nuance of how mothers are thinking about retirement. And then finally, given the potential for SSA benefits, what is the role of SSA benefits in families planning? How are they thinking about those? So this area is we don't know a lot, there's not a lot in the literature. So we're using, this is a fancy word, and then these lots of words to describe our method, which is an explanatory sequential mixed methods approach. All that means is that we're going to go to available data sources, some available national survey data, to kind of get the lay of the land of broad brushstrokes about what we can find about this area. Then we're going to use that information to to do some qualitative collection and analysis. And we're going to put these things together really to get a more nuanced understanding of mothers' experiences, both in terms of breadth and depth. So what are we doing for our quantitative piece? We are using publicly available national survey data from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth in 1979, where we're linking mothers in the NLSY 79 to their children in the child and young adult sample. So this is like one of the few publicly available data sets that allows us to understand children and then mothers' outcomes as well. We have outcomes on mothers through 2018. So the mothers are sort of just on the cusp of retirement at that time. And we have sort of broad measures of retirement behavior. Our analysis is nothing fancy. We're basically doing a little bit of work to make mothers of children with disabilities more comparable on different measures to mothers of typically developing children, and then we're doing some descriptive work. We're going to use that analysis to inform our qualitative work, and for that we interviewed 12 mothers. They were all 45 years or older. This was a requirement for our sample, had at least one child with disability who they were providing a minimum of 10 hours of care for per month. We conducted semi-structured interviews, meaning we had an interview guide and we asked them all the same questions. The interviews lasted for about 60 minutes, and we then coded what they said in terms of themes. So what do we find? In our first bullet, right, was there was about sort of looking at broad differences in patterns of retirement outcomes. And for that, we're going to really rely on our quantitative data. Here, I'm showing you just a graph. We want to sort of understand employment trajectories, since that's going to inform the context of retirement. And as with previous literature, we find that mothers of children with disabilities are working in lower proportions, even across sort of different trajectories of their child's life, especially for mothers who tell us that they have significant caregiving responsibilities. Despite these differences in employment, we don't find any differences, or at least statistically significant differences, in these objective measures of retirement behavior. So no differences in savings, withdrawal, planned retirement age, the age they think that they'll receive SSA benefits, whether they'll be working at age 65. We do find that mothers of children with significant caregiving responsibilities, those that have been working, are less likely to say in the 2018 wave of the survey that they are retired than the rest of the sample. So maybe continuing to work longer if they have been working. So what can we take from that? Does that mean that there aren't differences in retirement behaviors for mothers of children with disabilities? Or does this really kind of reflect what we're measuring and that maybe we're not measuring it that well, right? So for that, we go to interviews with our mothers, and we hear from mothers that in fact, they feel that parenting a child with disability has really sort of influenced their retirement behaviors and choices, and I'll put those in quotes. So we heard from mothers that caregiving responsibilities really limited how much they were able to work, the types of jobs that they had. Many chose flexibility over pay or advancement, right? So that's going to influence sort of what that means as they enter retirement. Some mothers told us that they were going to be working longer than they might otherwise have to save for retirement. Others had to leave the labor market early for caregiving responsibilities. As one mother told us, at one point he had over 20 different doctors, juggling appointments, juggling surgery, complications, routine tests all the time. There would be no way, I can't work. There's just too much to be taken care of, right? So we do hear from mothers, right, that they feel that this is an important piece of their retirement outcomes, even if we are not seeing that in our data, our quantitative data. So this really also bleeds into our second question, which is how are mothers thinking about retirement? And we heard from mothers that retirement plans really changed since having a child with a disability, and that was particularly due to what the financial needs of their children and uncertainty around those financial needs, I'll say. In terms of like the retirement decision, you know, like other households, things that sort of played a role were their spouse's retirement, household financial circumstances, and then maybe more, unlike other households, I'll say, caregiving and what that was going to look like in future years, and their child's living situation. Again, we heard a lot of uncertainty about that, and so that sort of played into how they were thinking about retirement. So one mother told us, I think I need to be earning up until age 72 to make sure that I have enough set aside for my daughter. I don't consider my needs to be primary. I consider hers to be primary. I've always thought everything I'm putting into the pot is 50% mine, 50% hers, right? So really this idea that for mothers of children with disabilities, right, retirement, thinking about how to set up their children for financial success is perhaps top of mind. We do have one measure in the NLSY of how people define retirement. And the one thing I want to highlight here is that mothers with significant caregiving responsibilities are, say in higher proportions, that they're more likely to have to continue to work out of necessity into retirement. So what does that mean for SSA benefits? That's sort of the third question that we have set up. And I don't have a slide about this, but the 2018 NLSY contains measures of whether people say that they're receiving retirement benefits. And we see that in our sample, mothers of children with disabilities, and particularly those with caregiving responsibilities, say that they're receiving retirement benefits in higher proportions than other mothers. And this is likely early retirement benefits given the age of the sample. Our qualitative data, interviews with mothers, provide us some more context here. However, mothers in our sample said that they figured SSA benefits into their retirement planning, but they did not expect to rely on them. And I think mothers sort of grouped all SSA benefits together, so their own and their children's, right? Like they sort of talked about this as one thing.
2 minutes, Molly.
Thank you. Most plan to draw on employer or investment-based retirement sources. So one mother told us, and this was pretty similar to what we heard, SSA benefits are part of the picture, but they are not the picture. We're not relying on those benefits. But one thing that I want to highlight here is that the mothers that we talked to were a really advantaged sample in a lot of ways. So racially homogenous, non-Hispanic white mothers with a median household income around $125,000, right? So that's and living in a resource-rich community. So that really is going to play a role into, sort of how SSA benefits might impact them and their resources that are available. So that really also tells us that it's important to understand the economic well-being of more diverse samples. That we heard from this very advantaged sample that they felt that they had significant financial concerns about retirement. You know, that sort of suggests that understanding the experiences of families with significant other barriers is going to be really important to understand. Finally, what does this mean for policy? So, I think this underscored for us sort of their general supports for caregiving for all families, and those can be very important for families of children with disabilities as well as sort of taking into consideration the specific unique needs and constraints for this population. So, and this is sort of throughout the child's life, right? And so maybe this looks like adapting current broad policies and supports to make sure that it's meeting the needs of these families, different formulas or eligibility or whatever that might be. And finally, in terms of SSA policy and benefits, we heard from mothers, right, that in our interviews, that they weren't really planning on relying on these benefits, and maybe they weren't totally sure what they were. So that combined with our survey data, which suggests that mothers might be combining both early retirement benefits and employment, suggests that doing some targeted outreach to families to help them understand what SSA benefits they're eligible for, and sort of any constraints in terms of earning limits might be important. Thank you.